about so maybe we are broadcasting now. Welcome to everybody who are following us via social medias, not at least to this very important conversation on the situation of the Baha'i in Iran. This situation is very much serious, and it has been for a long time. This is actually the second discussion that I am taking part in and is co-hosting. So thank you very much to the Baha'i international community for this cooperation, and thank you to all our guests who are with us today to share your experiences and the work that you are doing in order for not at least us legislators to step up the work in the national parliaments, in the European Parliament, but also, of course, on a UN level, because it is a matter of human rights. It is a matter of respect of international law that we are talking about today. During the upcoming hour, we will discuss the situation of the Baha'i religious community in Iran and what we as European Parliament and the EU as a whole can help out with. And therefore, I also have my colleague Cornelia Ernst with me, who will also share her perspective on the work that is being conducted today, but also what we could do more of in the Parliament. We will draw on the extensive knowledge of on the matter from experts joining us. But let me also start by briefly introducing everybody to the subject of today. Following the Islamic Revolution of Iran, 1979, members of the Baha'i faith, the largest religious minority in the country, have been subjected to a relentless campaign of persecution. This persecution has impacted the lives of generations, from young infants to the frail elderly. In the words of the former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion or Belief, Heiner Bielefeld, Iranian Baha'is experience persecution from the cradle to the grave and beyond. That is what we are talking about. The official policy of the Iranian government against their Baha'i citizens is summarized in a government memorandum obtained in 1993 by the UN Special Representative on the Human Rights Situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Produced in 1991 by Iran's Supreme Revolutionary Cultural Council and approved by the Supreme Leader Khomeini, this document, entitled The Baha'is Question, sets forth four specific guidelines for dealing with the Baha'is. It states that the governments dealing with Baha'is must be in such a way that their progress and development are blocked. It outlines a series of measures to restrict the educational, the economic and cultural life of Iranian Baha'is. This memorandum remains in effect, unfortunately, until today. Many other directives denying rights to the Baha'is have been adopted since, whether in the field of education, work, or other. A new trend of translating the 1991 memorandum into provincial directives is particularly worrisome. Recently, a directive from the Commission on Ethnicities, Sects, and Religions in the city of Sari in Mazandaran province was uncovered by the International Federation of Human Rights, calling for the rigorous control of the Baha'is community in virtual all aspects of life. Alongside these official documents, the Iranian government has pursued a systematic pattern of propaganda, both official and unofficial, against Baha'is belief and Baha'is community. This has been done through extensive use of mass media to portray the Baha'is as the source of every conceivable evil. So it's being done directly through policies, but it's also being done through portraying the Baha'i community in media as a group that shouldn't be trusted, and all the tools possible is being used by the Iranian regime. For us to also make sure to not only talk, but also go from words to actions, these conversations are so important. It's important to spread knowledge about the situation for those who have less knowledge, but it's also important to put pressure on the legislator, as myself and my colleague Cornelia. So therefore, I once again want to thank the Baha'i international community for this cooperation, and I will now leave the floor to my colleague Cornelia Ernst for her first intervention. The floor is yours, Cornelia, and thank you for being with us.
I have to thank, it's also for me a very important invitation and an important event, and I don't say it because it is the blah 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 in the beginning of the event. No, it's really important for us to discuss, because many members of the European Parliament don't know about what we speak. And I think if we look at the situation of the Baha'i, this is more or less an all-round discrimination. I would say it in this way, includes so many aspects: no admission to the universities, you said it, no work permits, arbitrary arrests, and now the additional identity card regulation has been added with the Baha'i. And what's that? What's that for a situation? They would have to deny their own religion. Otherwise, the Baha'i community cannot longer be able to carry out many day-by-day business without this ship card. And I think we should speak about such a very concrete act of discrimination, because the consequences are horrible for hotel booking, healthcare, distribution of subsidized goods, such petrol and other things. We can speak about so many things. If we have such a situation where I have to deny my own religion, this is unacceptable. And if we look at the next days, we have the next election in Iran, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing, that gives us hope that the things will get better. And the most promising candidate in the presidential election is Raisi, and he is considered an ally of Ayatollah Khamenei. Yeah, I think this is not really hopeful. Dear friends, I think we cannot wait. Whatever will be in the election, whatever the outcome of the election, this is not our view. We have to mobilize the public precisely because there is no prospect of improvement, because even more harshness is to be expected against the Baha'i. And the right to religious freedom must apply to everyone and everywhere. And this is a topic in the European Union, and we have to put this topic in our debates more than more. And yeah, I said it is a topic in the European Parliament, and I think we need different steps, and we should speak about steps. What can we do in practice? And I think what I say, blah blah blah. Yeah, and I think we should also debate the topic of the human rights dialogue. I think yes, we need a human rights dialogue. However the situation is in Iran, we need it, and it must be resumed. And this is a diplomatic task of the member states, of the EU, and of us as members of the European Parliament. And we can only be successful if we forego double standards in dealing with human rights. If we deal honestly with this topic ourselves and don't pretend that we in Europe have no problems with that. Human rights are also not an object of trade. And what does it mean? I think this is very important for us as European Parliament. Yes, we members of the European Parliament are also fighting for the JCPOA at the same time, because we don't want Iran to arm itself with nuclear weapons and for greater war dangers in the broader Middle East. Yes, that's true. But that mustn't mean that we let the regime get away with a with a policy of disparaging human rights towards those who think differently. This is very, very important, and it's not so easy for the European Union, especially not for the members. The crimes against the Baha'i community must be stopped. This has to be a topic also when we go to Tehran as MEPs, and we try to go in September, and want to put it also in our agenda. As president of the Iran delegation, I have taken up this problem several times in the delegation, in Tehran too, and we will turn to the UN Human Rights Council also about the new passport regulation. And another possibility we should discuss is a petition to the European Parliament to do more for religious freedom, especially for the Baha'i. And I would like to discuss also other possibilities to act. And yes, and I think this is the sense of this event. And again, thank you very much for this invitation.
Thank you very much, Cornelia, for the introduction. I totally agree with you about the mobilization that we really need to make, not at least in the European Parliament itself. And I'm happy to hear about the proposals coming from you as the chair of the Iran delegation. And I also, as my role as an MEP, look forward to continue working together on this topic, and very often, the situation of Baha'is had been neglected in the parliament, but I'm happy that we are at least some in the parliament who are taking initiatives, not at least when there are resolutions on Iran, on a broader note, also raising and addressing the situation of Baha'is. So thank you for that. Now we will go over to a few minutes of a short video portraying and showing the hate speech taking place against the Baha'is in Iran.
که راه میداده میگم من بهاییم، اینو باید کشتش. بهائی‌ها خیلی بدجنسن. بهائی‌ها دنباله اسب زین کرده میگردن، بپرن روش برن. دنبال سفره آماده است بشینن بخورن. بهائی‌ها خیلی بدجنسن. میخوان کمترین هزینه رو بدن، عالی ترین بهره رو بدن. بهائیت رو انگلیس درست کرده، اسرائیل و یهود درست کرده. بهائی‌ها قبلشون حیفاست.
شستن میت بهایی در قصالخونه میت بهایی رو توی دریان که بندازید شما نجسه، از دریان درش بیارید نجسه. میت بهایی، چون بهایی نجسه به فتوای همین فقها، آبشان که بکشید نجسه، آبی هم که از بدنش میریزه نجسه، همه را نجسه و نباید اصلا غسلش داد. میت بهایی رو حرام است غسلش بدن، باید بدون غسل و بدون کفن اینها بگذارن، شهرداری بدنش رو برداره میبره هر کاریش میخواد بکنه.
This video really shows, puts or portraits what we have been talking about until now and what we are going to continue talk about, the hatred that is used against or the hatred that Baha'is are facing in Iran. And the cause of the Baha'is is a cause of the respect of international law. It's the cause of the respect of human rights. When making an exception for one group as regards to their right to their international, their human rights, we also open up the door to make exception for more groups. So the rights of the Baha'is is the rights of all people all around the world for their human rights. With this said, I will continue. We will continue to our next guest and or speaker, Diana, a representative of Baha'i international community, who very well know how the situation is on the ground. The floor is yours, Diana.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this panel and for the interest that has been expressed by members of the European Parliament on the situation of the Baha'is. We're very grateful. So perhaps you know very well, but maybe I should explain part of the video why it is clerics that are shown in this video, and that it's not only religious leaders in Iran that are persecuting the Baha'is, but also political leaders, because the political leaders in Iran are clerics. The supreme leader is a cleric. Every single president, except for one, that was elected were clerics. And even the one that you mentioned, Mrs. Ernst, as the probable person who will be elected, again, is a cleric. So I think that there is this combination between the religion, because it's an Islamic republic, and the state that makes it so complicated and so easy for the Baha'is to be persecuted by the religious leaders, is that they also have the political power in their hands. You mentioned, the special rapporteur who said from cradle to grave, Heiner Bielefeld. And really, I wanted to say that the persecutions that the Baha'is are facing is multi-generational. It has been now over 3 generations of Baha'is who have been facing persecuted. And we can say without really any doubt that every single individual in Iran, every single Baha'i has been affected in one way or another by this persecution. It leaves no one, no one is excluded from this blanket of persecution that has been organized precisely because it is ingrained in legislation, but also in those documents that you mentioned, Evin, all the documents that have been revealed and that show the systematic nature of this persecution. I'll just give you one example about how every single person has been, one of the Baha'is in Iran told me that, they have all gone and registered, given their, to be represented by a lawyer, because they know that at one time or another in their lives, they're going to be in prison. So they have done that as a precaution. I mean, that, we living in Europe, we would never think of something like that. So these documents that you've mentioned, of course, the 1991 document that you've mentioned that was signed by the Supreme Leader and is still in, as you said, in function, but also a lot of other documents. I would probably mention the one that was also revealed by the Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief, the late Asma Jahangir, in 2005, where the Baha'i, where all the forces in Iran were asked to monitor the Baha'is. And then we see this monitoring now in the document that you have, the provincial document that you have mentioned, that is in Mazandaran, also to monitor the Baha'is. And something that has been added to that, which is quite incredible, again for us, is to go and try to convert school children to Islam. So really even go to small young children and have this effect on them. Maybe just to finish, we have seen this campaign of incitement to hatred from the photos, and you've seen the videos. This is something that has been increasing in Iran. And you see, Iran doesn't even respect its own laws, because we at the Baha'i international community, we do believe that, you can counter hate speech by more speech. But the problem is that Iran, even the press law, has a right of reply. But this is not accepted, and the Baha'is don't have any platform to counter this misinformation. So, and because they're not protected in the constitution, then it leaves the door open for any form of persecution of the Baha'is. So I think this is really important that, as you have mentioned, in all the conversations with the Iranian government, this question be raised so that, we have seen the effects at the United Nations. I am, in Geneva at the Human Rights Council and also, and this is very important. We see the effect that Iran always tries to defend itself, in international fora. So that's why it's so important that the European Parliament also and the European Union raises this issue constantly with the Iranian authorities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana. And me and Cornelia will, of course, also continue taking it with us in the discussions, about the situation in Iran. And hope that many more, or the knowledge will be spread in the Parliament, and many more colleagues will be joining us in our common struggle. The next speaker I want to give the floor to is Naz, the Director of International Human Rights Programs of the University of Oxford. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much. It's I was going to say a pleasure to be with you, but of course it's on a very heavy topic. It is a pleasure to be on an all-female panel. I don't think it's ever happened to me before. And by raising this human rights issue, of course, we are not neglecting women's rights and other minority rights. And in Iran, by taking this forward, we are standing up for all human rights, as you mentioned so poignantly at the beginning. I just have, in the 5 minutes, I just have two purposes. One is to illustrate that it is persecution, and secondly, that it is state-driven. And there is so much evidence that this is not at all a difficult case to make. But in these days of misinformation and propaganda, it is quite right that we go back to basics and see what is the evidence of these two. Regarding whether the treatment of the Baha'is in Iran should be considered persecution, we know that international human rights law does not have a definition, a single definition of persecution, but it finds of course, it's in criminal law, it finds its way somehow into human rights law when we are looking at the Refugee Convention and what is the evidence for persecution. And some of the indicators of persecution that are discussed are pursuing a population with malignancy, so abusively or seeking to diminish them, to hunt a particular population, injurious action, trying to oppress people, especially for so-called heretical belief, to inflict severe violations of human rights law. And this would be evidenced through acts of violence, including mental violence, through legal, administrative, police, and judicial measures against the population and discriminatory punishment. And I would submit to you that there is lots of evidence of discrimination, severe violations, mental persecution, then the painting of Baha'is as holders of heretical belief, and then seeking to hunt them, diminish them, and abuse them. So, having suggested that it is persecution, then what is the source of the persecution? We know that, for example, Pew makes a distinction between societal hostilities on the grounds of religion or belief and government restrictions. And this seems to go far beyond government restriction to government directed persecution. It is quite distinctively state-driven, which of all the cases of violations of freedom of religion or belief and targeting of minorities around the world, many of which are deeply concerning and horrifying, this is quite a distinct element of this persecution, that it is established as state policy. So if we're trying to make that case, then where is our evidence for that? That, the claim that it is state-driven, it's multifaceted, and the severity we've already talked about. Well, I want to suggest that you might want to look at iranbahaipersecution.bic.org. It's Iran Baha'i Persecution, one word, .bic for Baha'i International Community.org, where there are thousands of documents where you can see the original. You can, the translations are provided for thousands of them, and it is constantly being replenished because sadly there is no shortage of documentary evidence, and it's increasing day by day. So you can see, for example, that there are well over 1,200 documents regarding the state's media-driven hatred against the Baha'is. And this is merely a sample of them, and a few were shown in that film. That hatred and those accusations, of which, as Diane said, there is no right of reply, those are echoed by state officials. And there's also, documentary evidence and videos where you can see state officials, for example, the prosecutor general echoing it and building policy and substantiating policy on the back of that. Then we have, so that's one evidence, is the hate speech and the documentary evidence. Then we have violence and aggression. And not only violence and aggression, but violence and aggression that is met with impunity. Now, it's purposeful, where murder usually leads to consequences in Iran, but not when it's against the Baha'is, or where there is loss of life, there is blood money payable, and Baha'is are the only population that are excluded from the payment of blood money, which is actually established Islamic law. I'm not the one arguing for blood money. But to purposefully exclude one particular population for exclusion takes policy rather than indirect discrimination or oversight. It makes it purposeful. Then there is the confiscation of assets by the state. So Baha'i property, whether holy places, community owned, or owned by individual Baha'is, can be confiscated and is confiscated. There is even a Supreme Court judgment just from last October that says, it regards Ivel, but is of broader significance. It says that all Baha'i property is illegitimate wealth, and therefore it is right. It is not only excusable, but it is correct that it should be confiscated. Not community owned, individual Baha'is owning here, poor farmers in a rural area. I think that was what your previous seminar was at. That property is illegitimate wealth. No proof of being terrorist or this or that. Nothing is required. Just the fact that they are Baha'is means that those assets can be confiscated. Then there is exclusion of Baha'is from general measures. So, the Constitution decides in its Article 13 to mention religious minorities. The largest non-Muslim religious minority community is the Baha'is. Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians are mentioned in Article 13. Baha'is are not. You don't have to mention religions in your constitution or minorities, but if you do and you leave out the largest one, that's purposeful. And even the citizenship charter under the current president gave nothing that could be used for the advancement seeking to advocate for the rights of Baha'is or others. And then we have targeting. So already the 1991 memorandum has been mentioned. This was the Supreme Revolutionary Cultural Council. And two of the panelists mentioned it just as a taste of the language: deny, refuse, expel, counter, confront, destroy Baha'is. And then we have the 2005 document that was also mentioned by the Command Headquarters of the Armed Forces of the Islamic Republic of Iran, where it calls for all Baha'is, all Baha'i activities to be identified, all individual Baha'is to be identified, that information must be collected and reported to the headquarters of what? Not just an intelligence headquarter, but of the armed forces. And then, of course, we have these, as if the 40+ years is not enough, as if the accusation of najasat, impurity, as was echoed in the film, is not enough. We have these very recent documents. So the September, I know I'm out of time. So the September 2020 meeting of the Commission on Sects and Religions in Mazandaran to control the misguided movements of the subversive Baha'i sect. I think really even the language speaks very honestly to the intent, and that steps should be taken. So by way of example, strict control, increased alertness to deter and control their measures, to coordinate with the intelligence services, to ban, to surveil, to follow up, and to implement actions against them. And as if all of that is not enough, we have the amendments to the Penal Code of Iran to Articles 499 and 500, which several international NGOs have drawn attention to, that the deviant proselytizing activities that are referred to will bear heavily on Baha'is as well as others. And there are stipulated harsh punishments regarding that, the new penal code. So I'm sorry to not be able to bear any good news, but we do at least have an all-female panel, and we do have the promise of even more attention by the European Parliament, that no document that refers to Iran and human rights can afford to leave this out. Because if Baha'is with this, these documentary evidence will not have their rights respected, then others will suffer even more gravely. Okay, and so thank you for that commitment.
Thank you very much. And of course, the situation, how it is, there is not, unfortunately, no good news to bring, but at least the good news is that we're having this conversation and we are taking our share of responsibility that more is happening, and the parliament, all other actors that has been mentioned before, that we are taking our share of responsibility so that all actors are being accountable for the lack of work that is being done, and the lack of discussions, for example, or pressure towards the Iranian government to stop persecuting the Baha'is. And I think you very well summarized how that it is a matter of persecution and it is state-driven. So I'm not even going to try to summarize what you said, Naz. I think everybody really felt that there is no question what the situation really concerns. So even though it's good news, there are no good news from the ground, we will take our share of responsibility that at least in the future there might be better news than we can deliver today. Now I would like to give the floor to our next guest, and that is Joël Fils, member of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, panel of experts on freedom of religion or belief. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and special thanks to the Baha'i international community for inviting me to speak on this very important topic, and of course to yourself, Madam la députée, as we say. So I would like to just say a few words about this, to follow up on what Nazis was saying about state persecution. I would like to just zoom in on a particular form of state persecution that Iran uses against its largest minority in Iran. And so I wanted to speak about anti-blasphemy laws, which, if you're not aware, call to criminalize speech that is deemed offensive to God or the sacred. And that includes offending religious doctrines or symbols, for wounding or insulting religious feelings. Now, these laws are obviously very dangerous because they place the state as the arbiters of truth. And ultimately, the state decides what's offensive and what's not offensive, and who is to judge? This is all very subjective. It also sheds light on government's intent and its relationship to religion, as Jan was speaking about before. Its relationship also to religious minorities, to political dissidents, to human rights activists, to intellectuals, and basically to all those who have different philosophical views to the state's official religion. And this is sadly the perfect recipe for political persecution of Baha'i in Iran, not least as well because the Baha'i philosophy is of one of universality and tries to be as inclusive as possible, trying to federate the different beliefs of different groups in a universal way. And of course, this is exactly the opposite of what Iran advocates for. And so I wrote 2 reports together with Cardozo Law Institute for the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is a bipartisan federal agency in the United States. And each report took 2 years to research on. And one research was about the language of the laws, of the blasphemy laws in the world, and how the language of the laws can provide insight to the state's relationship with the religion. And the second report was about how the laws are implemented in practice. Now, in both cases, Iran was one of the most dangerous countries in the world. So Iran's law, the way it's written, is the first most dangerous country in the world. And in terms of implementation, we found out that it was the second most dangerous country in the world, the way it implements its law. Now, all of this, of course, is limited in Iran because we could only base our judgments on press, and of course, given the fact that the press is so dramatically censored in Iran, it was impossible. So this is only the tip of the iceberg, right? And even with the tip of the iceberg in Iran, Iran is the #1 most dangerous law, and #2, the second most dangerous country in the world to implement its blasphemy laws. Now, you might be interested in the language of the law. Why is Iran's law the most dangerous in the world? We went through a whole range of criteria. For example, does the law respect freedom of religion or belief? Does it respect freedom of expression? Is the law vague? Are the penalties proportional? Are groups discriminated amongst each other? And many other criteria. And of course, we know that the so-called crime of blasphemy is sanctioned through the death penalty in Iran. So immediately that made Iran a very dangerous country. Indeed, the groups are discriminated, namely Baha'i as a group is definitely discriminated in Iran. And the level of state religions protections in Iran is extremely strong as well. So the state does everything it can to protect the state religion. And that was a factor in ensuring that, Iran went right up to the top of the most dangerous countries. Now, then in the second report, we wanted to see what's going on, how in practice, not in the way that the law is drafted, but in practice, what happens. Now, where do the state agents enforce these blasphemy laws the most? how do police officers conduct themselves? How do the judicial authorities conduct themselves? Where is there the most violence in the world? And also, who are the victims? And what is the role of social media platforms as well? Now, we found a treasure of findings, and I'm just going to select those that concern Iran. Okay, so first of all, 81% of all the cases of state enforcement of blasphemy laws around the world come from only 10 countries. And the second highest country is Pakistan. So there was, the second highest country was Iran. So the first highest country is Pakistan with 184 cases. The second is Iran, and the third is Russia. The second, we found 96 cases between, in a period of 5 years in Iran. And this, once again, it's only the tip of the iceberg, as we have there's very limited press freedom in Iran. And so, you know, what we could find was really the tip of the iceberg. 96 reported official blasphemy cases for a period between 2014 and 2018. Now, we only found 4 countries where state officials were responsible for incidents of violence. And guess what? Iran is one of those 4 countries. We have Pakistan, Iran, Algeria, and Egypt. And Iran, yet again, was one of those 4 countries where state officials were responsible for torture, cruel, or inhumane treatment. We also found in Iran, as well as in other countries, that there were human rights due process violations that also occurred. And then we wanted to find out who are the victims. Now, it's very interesting because there are some religious groups that report a lot blasphemy allegations that are sort of waged against the members of their community. And some religious groups report a bit less. For example, you know, Muslim groups report less than some Christian groups, which have a whole sort of infrastructure that enable them as a civil society to report more on the levels of persecution. And we found out that actually Muslims accounted more than half of the persons arrested, prosecuted, or punished for blasphemy allegations, out of those that we found, of course, because there are many cases where we couldn't find necessarily the religious belonging of that individual, but in the cases where we found, over the majority were Muslim. And this is important. Why? Because often you have countries like Iran or other Muslim majority states that say, oh, the fight against blasphemy allegations is a Western-driven Islamophobic agenda, right? And so this was a very important finding us, because it shows that it's not the case. Actually, if you fight against blasphemy, you're also defending the rights of Muslims themselves. And so this, you know, political argumentation of just saying, oh, this is a Western-driven agenda, this is incorrect. Now, out of the other groups frequently targeted, we have 25% Christians, 7% atheists, 7% Baha'i, and 3% Hindus. Now, this 7% statistics of Baha'i is underestimated. Why? Because of the official reporting procedures in Iran, it is impossible to track down. And so once again, the official, you know, the visible articles, the visible cases constitute 7%. But there are many invisible cases that have not been reported in the media. We did have a Persian speaker to monitor the Iranian media. We did use some Iranian NGOs and human rights coalitions, but yet again, this is not about, you know, how many articles you find in the press. It's about all the underreported cases that didn't, fortunately, sort of appear for them in the media, or unfortunately, you know. So yet again, very, very small statistics, 7%. Many of those Baha'i have been persecuted in Iran. They are constantly facing tremendous threats, and it's important for the European Parliament to ensure that this is high on the international agenda, in terms of freedom of religion or belief and freedom of expression, and that the reporting process as well must improve so that we can fully grasp, and so that the international community can fully grasp the depth and the level of persecution of the Baha'i in Iran. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joelle. You really showed how the struggle for the religious freedom of one group is the struggle for the religious freedom of all groups. Thank you very much for that. And now I wanted to give the floor to our last guest, Gisela Castro, EU delegate for the International Federation of Human Rights. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Baha'i international community for inviting me to speak. So as you said, I work for FIDH, the International Federation for Human Rights. We are a federation of human rights organizations, of national human rights organizations, basically. And we have 3 members that work on Iran, Justice for Iran, the League for the Defense of Human Rights in Iran, and the Defenders of Human Rights Center. All 3 of them are working in exile, of course, because of the situation in the country. If you allow me, I will take a bit of a step back and talk a little bit more about the overall human rights situation, and how the Baha'i community situation fits into that, and also about what the possibilities are at the international level. And so we have an office here. I'm based in Brussels, and we have also an office in Geneva and presence in New York, where we do international advocacy, and I'll share a little bit about our experience. So at FIDH, we follow the situation of the Baha'i community through the lens of other issues, including the situation of human rights defenders in Iran, who have faced increasing criminalization over the past 15 years. We published a report back in August 2019 that is a bit outdated now, but so this is in collaboration with the World Organization Against Torture, in which we looked at the trends and patterns of the persecution of human rights defenders. And we saw that minority rights activists were among the ones that were most targeted, along with women, human rights defenders, human rights lawyers, and labor rights activists as well. And so the report looks a little bit about to the way in which the legal system is used against human rights defenders. And so here we see very clearly that minority rights, and especially the Baha'i community, as has been explained by the previous panelists, they are targeted, and their representatives, their defenders, are targeted as well. We also published a report on the use of the death penalty in Iran, and we looked as well as the trends and patterns there, and how they constituted violations of a lot of fundamental provisions of international law. The death penalty in Iran is used for crimes that are not the most serious. They're used against children, women, LGBT people, protesters, and against ethnic communities and religious minorities. We have this report that we published that also looks at how the lawyers of the people, the death row inmates, are also persecuted. So this is another way in which the Iranian regime goes against religious minorities, and including and especially the Baha'i community. And in this context, yes, you mentioned it, so I won't go too much into detail, but we did contribute to the analysis of this document that was uncovered from September 2020, where a high-level government commission decided to significantly increase the repression of religious minorities. And again, I'm not going to go into detail because it has been covered, but I think it's really, really compelling to see. I mean, it's just another document that gives more, that confirms the fact that this is a state-sanctioned, statewide policy that is, and that's what it tells us, I think, is that the international community's engagement should be with the Iranian state as such, and with the government and the authorities, in order to address the situation of the Baha'i community. I'll just mention really quickly that we're very worried about the human rights situation, especially in the domestic political context that we have, and with the elections coming up, and in addition to all the concerns that we have regarding the outcome of the elections, and that this was mentioned as well at the beginning, but also about the elections as such, and how they cannot be considered free and fair at all. We just published a briefing on this, and so we explore all the different reasons why these elections cannot be considered free and fair at all. And I won't go into detail here because I only have 5 minutes, but I'm happy to answer any questions regarding the elections. And so what can we do at the international level? To be perfectly honest, when I was preparing for this presentation, I was a bit disheartened, because when you look at the action that has been led by international human rights organizations and also local human rights defenders that have been engaging with international institutions, the results have not been good. The UN institutions have struggled to actually have any real impacts in Iran. There have been a lot of very good developments, especially in Geneva with the Human Rights Council, the treaty bodies, etc. That we have a huge body of recommendations that have been made to the Iranian authorities, but these recommendations have not been able to transform into real change because they have lacked the political support from the UN Security Council, and from my view also from Western powers, and especially the European Union. The European Union, I believe, has not been ambitious enough in the support to all the recommendations that have been produced by international human rights mechanisms. Another element that makes our work on Iran especially difficult, of course, is all of the nuclear elements. So already before the US withdrew from the nuclear deal, we had trouble because every time we brought up human rights in Iran, we brought up the situation and we were kind of pushed back with the nuclear politics. And after the US withdrew, for me and for a lot of us, it was very disappointing because we knew that the response that we were going to get is, okay, now we need to revive the deal and we cannot speak about human rights for a while. And this has somewhat been the case. I mean, there have been some good developments to some extent in especially the EU's engagement on human rights, but still, we can feel that the international community remains reluctant to adopt ambitious positions on human rights, and the result of all this is that the international community has failed to make it costly for Iran to continue with human rights violations. The human rights violations and the human rights situation in Iran continues to be the way it is because it doesn't cost anything to the regime to continue with the human rights violations. So in this context, we have tried at FIDH to look at, and with our members especially, we have tried to look at alternative advocacy paths that can have an impact on the situation in Iran. And I just want to highlight two of them. One is the business and human rights path. So after the nuclear deal and everything, there was a bit of a rush of businesses to Iran, and we engaged on a case of an Italian company, an Italian telecoms company called Italtel, that signed a contract with the telecommunications company of Iran to provide telecom products and services. And we filed a complaint to the OECD national contact point on that, arguing basically that the Italian company had failed to conduct its due diligence, on human rights, and that it had failed to identify the risks of contributing to severe negative human rights impacts, because as it provided tech to a hugely repressive government like Iran, we argued that the checks that they had done were not sufficient given the situation. The outcome of this case was interesting because the OECD national contact point actually said that the company, the Italian company, had conducted its human rights due diligence. So we lost the case, but the fact that we filed it led the company to reassess its agreement and to withdraw some of the services that it had previously offered to provide. So it was a very interesting case, and I'm happy to share more information. And I think it shows how when we're a bit blocked with kind of the traditional ways of engagement with the human rights situation, with the at the UN, at the EU, etc., we can try and find alternatives. And especially when it comes to I'm an EU citizen, when it comes to our own companies going to Iran and perhaps contributing to human rights violations. And something else that I wanted to mention here is that we've also engaged in sanctions advocacy with the EU. So what happened is after the November 2019 protests and the severe repression of the protests back in 2019, our member Justice for Iran conducted a research to identify the perpetrators of the violations that had occurred during this unprecedentedly violent wave of repression. And based on this research, we submitted names of individuals and entities that we believed had to be added to the list of individuals under sanctions under the EU regime. And so we succeeded in the end. So the announcement of the listings, I think, happened probably in March this year, or in 2021 for sure. I think it was March. And it was interesting because during these efforts, we did see all of the obstacles of the things that I mentioned earlier of the nuclear deal, etc. Because it was very clear that EU member states were waiting to see what would happen during the US election. They wanted to see if President Trump was going to be reelected because they wanted to make sure that there were credible perspectives of reviving the deal, the nuclear deal, before they moved with sanctions. This is how we saw it and how we perceived it. So it was interesting, but in the end, so they managed to make the listings. We welcomed these listings. We think it's a very good step in the right direction. However, it's not enough, and it is absolutely. We hope that this will serve as a stepping stone towards a new, more ambitious EU-Iran policy with human rights at its core, because again, this is the issue, and this was mentioned by several of my colleagues here. The problem is that the engagement of the international community does not put human rights at the core. We put other things at the core, and this is a problem that we have with many countries. To be honest, I work on many countries around the world, and we have this problem on many countries. But with Iran, it seems like it's a step further. It's really it seems like human rights are always sidelining when it comes to engaging. So we hope that these sanctions listings will allow the EU to go further now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the splendid work that you are doing and all the examples that you took. Of course, nuclear deals, the deal is important, but as well is the human rights. So we cannot as European Union or international community put aside the most important elements of international law, human rights and democracy, because of other elements. We need to be able to do both of the things at the same time. And I also hope, of course, that we will go from words to actions also regarding the decisions of sanctions, for example, that you mentioned. So unfortunately, the time is running fast when we are discussing important topics, as the topic that we have been discussing today, the situation of Baha'is in Iran today. And I also want to thank everybody who have been with us today, who have been listening to this conversation through social medias or is with us via the Zoom link that was sent out. And unfortunately, I see that there are a few questions, some of them concerns contact information to the panelists. Please do get in touch with the Baha'i international community or with myself, and I promise that I will make sure that you get the information to the guests, the speakers that you want to get in touch with. I'm sorry that we haven't had more time for any Q&A, but I really think that I at least learned a lot from the interventions that I have heard and taken part of today by the all-female panel, as Naz very well expressed it. I'm also very much impressed with all this knowledge, all these experiences that all the speakers have. And I look forward to continue working with the Baha'i international community, but also our speakers today for our common struggle for the rights of the Baha'is in Iran and elsewhere. Thank you very much for being with us today. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for hosting the meeting. Thank you, Evin.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Can we have this video?
Yes, so it is on the website of the Baha'i international community,
Okay, fine.
or my